Mrs. Peel, when needed.
In the 1960s, one colourful British series put its mark on pop culture. A show about a stylish crime-fighting duo in a world of absurd plots, over-the-top characters and utterly ridiculous situations.
Perhaps I am intruding.
You're not intruding.
Where of course they consumed lots of champagne. No assembly is necessary. The Avengers.
That was very, very dirty.
The Avengers is a 1960s British television series that is fondly remembered across the world thanks to its memorably iconic lead characters. And despite there being multiple main characters across the show's 6-season run, it's the 2 seasons revolving around the pairing of John Steed and Mrs. Emma Peel that are etched into that decade's popular culture. If that's your main exposure to the series, then let me blow your mind by talking about the other characters. Also, if you haven't worked it out by this stage, this has absolutely nothing to do with the Marvel Comics and those other Avengers. Well, at least I assume so.
Where needed.
The show started as a black and white studio-bound crime series with a touch of hard-boiled noir thriller and had an evolving visual style which morphed into a colourful absurdist spy series before coming down to earth in its final year.
For you, Mrs. Peel.
I sense a bribe.
There were lots of undercover capers, a lot of breaking and entering, fights, and excessive consumption of high-end sparkling wine.
How did I get here?
Originally there was a short-lived half-hour series from 1960 called Police Surgeon, made by one of the commercial TV franchisees in the UK, ABC Television. Police Surgeon wasn't a hit, but the star of that half-hour series, Ian Hendry, was seen as a star in the making. ABC's head of drama, Canadian import Sydney Newman, set producer Leonard White on a path for a new 1-hour series. The idea was to take a new character played by Hendry, a doctor who gets involved in fighting crime, and then pairing him off with a shadowy agent-type character, partly to make it feel like a different show, and partly to share the workload between the cast members. The show would be called, well, let's just call it The Avengers, and if we think of something better later on, well, Dr. David Keel's fiancée is accidentally killed. Keel teams up with shady character John Steed to bring the killers to justice. Et voila, The Avengers. But after that, there wasn't an awful lot of actual avenging, revenging, vengeance, retaliation, retribution, or payback of any description. Just Keel and Steed sorting out wrongdoers. The stories could be based around murder mysteries, criminal activities, and occasionally spy antics, but like the Spruce Goose, would remain fairly grounded. Even though he was initially conceived of as a sidekick to Dr. Keel, Steed would become a breakout character throughout the course of the first year. Of course, very little of that first year exists in any archives, but more on that later.
Where do we start?
Patrick Macnee was born in Britain, but much of his early career was in Canada. By the 1960s, he was back in Britain and working as a producer, when the chance to co-star in The Avengers popped up. After a few episodes, Macnee was told by producers that his character wasn't working, and the actor set about coming up with a way to inject more personality. As written, Steed was rather amoral and aloof, and not yet fixed as an actual government agent.
Here we go.
Macnee created a character for himself, and to sell the illusion, gave the character a stylish, if slightly anachronistic wardrobe to set the character up as a gentleman around town. A tailored suit, a bowler hat, and an umbrella with a sword built in would become his standard attire. My standard attire is similar though. You have to substitute the tailored suit for a uniform, and instead of a bowler hat it's a cardboard hat with a hairnet, and instead of a sword cane it's a credit card reader, and instead of a spy, I work at McDonald's. Look, other than that we're exactly the same. Steed in early years was not particularly pleasant, flippant in the face of misery, and he could also be quite ruthless.
Your philanthropy is just a little unexpected, I must say.
The show sauntered along on the charm of its stars and became successful, but a longer than usual gap between the first and second season due to an extended actors' strike saw Ian Hendry leave to concentrate on a movie career.
Thinking of giving it up?
With Hendry's departure, the option was to recast or cancel the series entirely. Patrick Macnee had made such an impression that having him be the star of the show rather than second banana wasn't a difficult move. But now they needed a new second banana. You need to have 2 bananas. Banana. None of the actors they looked at were quite right.
Nothing that'd really suit me, I'm afraid.
Until the image of a British colonist in Africa with a gun strapped to her waist while she tended to her children gave the producers the idea of a glamorous female character, but a character not written all that differently as they would for a male character. The new character would kick ass and be Steed's equal. One of the candidates was Blackman.
How's that, eh?
Just what the doctor ordered.
Series creator Sidney Newman wasn't so sure, due to Blackman's reputation for rank charm school acting, which is always smiling glamorously while speaking. Rank Charm School refers to British film company The Rank Organisation, who were trying to manufacture British stars and starlets along the lines of Hollywood. Internally, it was called the Company of Youth and would teach the would-be stars under contract to Rank the basics of acting, fencing, diction, but also things like deportment.
Well, they'll be out soon. Oh, if it's not an impertinent question, how did you...
It is.
Okay, come.
So not just how to act on stage, but how to act posh in really, really upmarket fish and chip shops.
In these vaults is £2 to £3 million worth of gold.
Rank Charm School was not a super complimentary epithet, but it fits about as good as any, and the label stuck. It gave us the likes of Joan Collins, Jill Ireland, Patrick Macnee and Christopher Lee, among others. Look, I attended the Rank Charm School for a term, majoring in how to look posh while holding a cigarette. But I dropped out because as a person making videos on YouTube about movies and television, I don't actually require any charm or charisma.
And this ridiculous charade you always have to play. You can't just tell me in plain, straightforward language that you're after a gold smuggler.
Ms. Blackman, owner of a killer smile, was told by producers, hey, don't smile.
I see you are an anthropologist.
Honor Blackman played Mrs. Cathy Gale, a widowed anthropologist who was knowledgeable and interested in various areas of scientific research, and also able to hold her own in a fight thanks to her judo skills. Cathy Gale would often be contemptuous of Steed's sometimes cold and aloof methods. She also wouldn't need Steed to rescue her all the time. A woman replacing a male star in an action series? TV reviewers at the time had a choice. They could either go on and on and on and on and on about complaining about a woman in an action role, or they could just enjoy the show and as a bonus continue to have sex for the rest of their lives. They chose the latter. Viewers too embraced the duo of John Steed and Mrs. Cathy Gale. Life goes on and the world didn't end. There was still a lot of action, but now with the added frisson of a slight sexual tension between the two leads. The two are strictly platonic partners, we think. Maybe, possibly.
I can't say I'm pleased.
Audiences loved the team, and the Avengers went from being a decent hit to a big hit.
We've been trying to reach an agreement with him.
But you have failed, and so you want him dead.
Yes.
While Keel had been a talented amateur, sucked into Steed's world, Cathy Gale's relationship with the government department managing Steed would become a little blurred. Was she an amateur roped in by Steed? Was she a freelancer?
You've been up to something fishy all day. I think it's time you explained what.
What's the matter? Don't you trust me?
Any reason why I should?
By the end of the third season, she was almost as much of a government official as Steed. Steed did have superiors. We would see them from time to time. Early on, it was a character known as 110. But consistency in this area was not considered all that important.
Might as well enjoy it while we're here.
Honor Blackman was coached on the martial arts moves she'd need to use on screen, in a studio, in an as-live production. To make things easier, her costumes were designed around what would work best for action scenes, and leather was chosen since it seemed durable enough to survive the action scenes. The whole fetishistic aspect was sort of, I guess, an unexpected bonus for some.
Sounds too easy.
At the time, wearing leather was limited to Air Force pilots, bikers, cowboys, cows, or people who were into bondage, which in no way limits pilots, bikers, cowboys, or cows being into bondage. The leather outfits were chosen mainly because they wouldn't rip in a fight scene or show something that they shouldn't. But instead of lowering the sexual tone for early 60s audiences, they did the opposite. Such was the reputation leather had, with Ted and Ethel at number 35. It was only much later that we discovered that Ted and Ethel were themselves inveterate swingers. Mrs. Cathy Gale was not Steed's only sidekick for the second season. There were 3 episodes with John Rollison as Dr. Martin King as a relatively low-effort way for the production to use some leftover Keel scripts, as well as 6 episodes where Steed enlisted the help of nightclub singer Venus Smith. Venus was young and seemed to have no reason to be in the show apart from a tenuous link to show business. Her episodes generally featured a music number sung by actress Julie Stevens. Early episodes have her dolled up as a singer in a jazz club, while later on she gets a pixie-ish haircut and the character has a much younger demeanour. While charming as played by Julie Stevens, the character of Venus does seem a little out of place, as do the jazz numbers sung live in the studio.
Not on your life. I'm going to take up knitting, eh, Sheba?
The idea of revolving sidekicks was put to one side because Cathy Gale was all anybody else saw. For the show's third season, it was firmly Steed and Cathy Gale. Mrs. Gale was mostly business, often annoyed at Steed for one reason or another, has a good eye for detection, but at the same time she's never once commented on him having a different dog each time. Cathy's status as a widow would occasionally be mentioned.
My husband was killed some years ago on our farm in Africa.
Apparently in the early 60s, her having a flirtatious relationship with Steed was somehow more palatable if Cathy was a widow.
What an extraordinary coincidence.
During the second and third seasons, some of the storylines would remain grounded crime stories, and more than a few installments would be steeped in espionage. You know, there'd be a few wannabe dictators looking to take over everything, but slowly a slightly whimsical tone and elements of fantasy would creep into plots. Here's another group who want to take over the world, but they're modelling themselves on the Roman Empire and giving themselves ancient Roman names.
Hello, Bruno. That's what you call a bacchanalia.
There's an episode where an astronomer predicts the Earth is about to be destroyed. Or there are occasional episodes with supernatural themes.
I did know somebody who tried shooting a pair of handcuffs off.
What happened?
Well, nowadays he's laughingly known as Lefty.
For its first 3 seasons, The Avengers was made in a multi-camera television studio and recorded to black and white videotape. Basically, episodes were made on a fortnightly basis with 10 days of rehearsals before a few hours in front of a camera to try and record the entire episode in one session, almost as if it was live, at ABC's Teddington Studios, which, while it sounds like a made-up place from a kid's book to anyone outside of Britain, it is indeed a real place in London, you know, because it's got a Costa coffee and everything. Any filmed inserts or pre-recorded action scenes, or indeed any music, would be fed into the studio feed as it was recorded to videotape.
What's it got to do with you?
I'm representing Her Majesty's government in the affair.
Does the government know?
Videotape editing was possible at the time, but it was rather primitive and was to be avoided if possible.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Scenes would be written so cameras and actors could move between sets in real time. As an example, in this episode, Honor Blackman has an elaborate hairdo that she is very careful to preserve since there was no possible way of making a major change or fix during recording. Fights in the studio would be practiced and choreographed. But if recording didn't go well, you'd really have to drop a major clanger to get the director to go for a retake.
I don't trust you, and from now on I won't let you out of my sight.
I recommend these words, funk, shint and artsole, because even though they technically aren't swear words, they're close enough they might get you another take. But if the worst comes to worst, could be left in. Of course, if you really wanted to guarantee a retake, you would just say Finished episodes were transferred to film to make overseas sales possible, and because television companies wanted to reuse expensive videotape. I dig, I once taped every episode of Grange Hill, but it ended up getting taped over with Dodger, Bonzo and the rest. Pro tip, if you're making a telerecording, basically pointing a film camera at a monitor, it really does help if you shut the screen door.
Then there's no truth in his story.
Not that part of it.
Program makers at the time never thought audiences would be interested in rewatching programs decades down the line. Master tapes or film recordings weren't always looked after. Only 3 episodes from the first season are known to exist. Everything from the second season onwards is available. There wasn't an awful lot of music in the series. Jazz musician Johnny Dankworth's theme tune topped and tailed each episode. Though it has to be said, it has all of the zing of an electric chair during an extended power outage.
Car hit him all right, but it wasn't hit and run.
Why not?
It hit him about 12 times.
This may sound a foolish question. Was that what killed him?
The show's popularity saw Patrick Macnee and Honor Blackman record a single, Kinky Boots. I won't subject you to it because it's one of those things that you really should never bring up. The single was quickly forgotten about, just as one might forget the bag containing ice cream that's on the backseat of your car. Oh shit, back in a minute. And then in 1990 the song was re-released and charted for reasons we will best chalk up to a mix of kitsch, irony, nostalgia, morbid curiosity and ecstasy. Macnee recalls that the stars did not have appreciative bosses at ABC, who were still of the old school of TV executives that did not value the talent in any way.
I haven't got anything today, I'm stingy.
Which has in no way changed. The new school, which replaced the old school, was basically the old school but with snappier suits and curious sniffles.
And as you're going to be out there anyway, pussyfooting along those sun-soaked shores.
Goodbye, Steve.
Eh?
That's what I said.
Goodbye.
Honor Blackman had decided she would leave at the end of her second year on the series, and was soon cast as Pussy Galore in the 1964 James Bond film Goldfinger.
Oh, how nice of her to remember me. What can she be doing in Fort Knox?
Longing for you.
The end of the third season is a kind of dividing line, separating the series before and after. For 3 years, each episode had to be recorded in one session, in the studio as if it were live, and on a few occasions was actually performed live to air. Early concessions to the desire to avoid videotape editing include pre-filming or pre-taping some scenes, and by the looks of it, crossing your fingers. Looking back, it's almost a different series, where the actors are desperately trying to get their lines out.
They get one special piece to transmit of a secret.
So nobody
Then they
can
can't
double-cross anybody else?
Exactly.
The adrenaline is pumping, there's a visible flop sweat, and there are occasional flubbed lines left in. The show's fourth season would see major changes in almost every area, with Patrick Macnee being one of the few carryovers. To keep the star on board, management begrudgingly offered Macnee a small piece of the show's profits, assuming there would be any. With one eye on foreign sales, the fourth season of The Avengers would be shot on 35mm film at Elstree Studios. With the filmed episodes, The Avengers would be screened in the US on the ABC network during prime time. While of course the company making the program in the UK was also named ABC, there was no link other than a common desire to appear early in the phone book.
I'd like some grapes.
Desperate for them, I'd say. Remarkable recovery.
A new production team was put in place, headed by producer Julian Wintle. Many production personnel were new to the series and had come from the feature film industry.
I am dead. I've been dead for quite some time.
Writer-producer Brian Clements was one of the few writers who would work on both versions of the show. Clements, along with producer Albert Fennell, would shape the series into the worldwide phenomenon it was about to become. Of course, Steed would need a new offsider, in the form of Mrs. Emma Peel, that's not a banana joke, to be played by actress Elizabeth Shepherd. Huh? After viewing a completed episode, the show's producer didn't feel like Shepherd had the right touch needed for the show, and Shepherd was reluctantly let go.
Good morning, Mrs. Peel.
Good morning, Steed. The door's open.
A hurried casting process yielded Diana Rigg, a little bit younger than Blackman, but Rigg had already made a name for herself as a serious actor. The name Emma Peel came about when they were looking to create the character, and one of the traits they were looking for was man appeal, or M appeal. So the new character was Mrs. Emma Peel, a widow after her husband went missing in the jungle, again with the widow's Steed. I mean, he's got a type, I'll give him that.
I'm very sorry to bother you.
Of course, the production initially treated Mrs. Peel as if she was Cathy Gale, giving Diana Rigg the same hairstyle and, for a time, leather outfits. Assuming, of course, that they actually gave Diana Rigg an outfit. Pretty soon, Rigg would make such an indelible impression in the series that the Emma Peel and John Steed pairing would become the series' default team. Emma Peel is possibly the most confidently competent person on the planet, an elegant combatant, as well as a sleuth with a wry sense of humour.
Sic fiat crustulum. Let's have a cookie, Crumbles.
The Latin cookie.
Peel and Steed make an engaging pair. Well, they rescue each other, but are definitely partners, definitely platonic friends. But a deeper connection was often hinted at. Slightly, if you read between the lines.
Gentlemen should knock before entering.
Emma Peel would soon find her own unique style.
May I take Modam's coat? May I venture to say that Modam looks the cat's whiskers?
Both Rigg and Macnee became style icons for a brief moment. Steed's character had evolved over the years. By the time of the filmed episodes, he was no longer a ruthless cad and a bounder, but a bon vivant who enjoyed the good life.
Educated, charming, cultured.
Ruthless, devious, scheming.
Mrs. Peel would sometimes carry a small pistol, while Macnee had decided he'd prefer Steed not to carry his own gun, usually preferring to use whatever was to hand. It's probably just as well, since Steed and Peel, and later Tara, seemed to have such an obsession for the bubbly that they could possibly have been drunk as lords most of the time.
Going up.
Steed usually drove a vintage Bentley, while Mrs. Emma Peel zoomed around in a Lotus Elan sports car.
I'm a bit shaken, that's all. Ooh, and a bruise you'll just have to take my word for.
The show, which had been a big hit, was about to become a massive hit. The format to the filmed episodes of The Avengers was an evolution of the videotape shows, just with more style and an ability to stage a fight scene much more effectively. There was also a great deal more location filming. Episodes were almost always set in a type of upper-class England that didn't really exist. It's almost Jeeves and Wooster territory. Posh accents, few people from the regions or the working class, lots of little English villages. Steed and Mrs. Peel lived in the city, but they're almost always driving along tree-lined country roads.
He had an accident last night. His pram ran out of control. That was my lunchtime refreshment.
The videotaped episodes had Steed and company occasionally jetting off to foreign locations, all created in the TV studio, of course. By the time of the filmed episodes, stories were set almost exclusively in a vaguely fantasy version of southern England. Production was now based in the Elstree-Borehamwood area, not far from central London. Most of the filmed episodes of The Avengers were shot at Elstree Studios. Yes, there were and are a number of studio facilities in that area, including nearby Pinewood. The Avengers filmed episodes were shot in the same facilities where a number of their commercial rivals were also filmed. The studio was later bought by the BBC, where it's now used to record EastEnders. Locations around the studio were put to good use in the filmed episodes, with fans later dubbing the area as Avengerland, where they would catalogue locations used in various series and visit. Incidentally, the area around my house is known as Stamland, but the only visitor I get is the guy who goes through my bin overnight to get the recyclable cans and bottles.
Now, isn't that a coincidence?
Isn't it just?
The fourth season features some stunning black and white photography and lighting, making for a massive upgrade to the series. Fourth season episodes would often revolve around a particular industry at the heart of an espionage or murder plot. A plot in a Scottish castle, a school for butlers, executive assistants involved with murders, a department store involving murders, or undertakers involving murders.
Business seems to be dying off.
Or murders on a golf course, murders by matchmakers, etc. If you can find them in the yellow pages, they can kill you.
6 bodies in an hour and 20 minutes. What do you call that?
A good first act.
Steed and Peel would investigate some crime.
One of our best agents was murdered yesterday. His name was Moran. He was shot 6 times and dumped in an alley.
Ostentatious?
Eh?
6 times.
Oh, yes.
As the season wore on, situations became more bizarre, slightly more surreal. Characters became more eccentric. And of course, the whole thing would end in a fight scene, because the more things changed, the more they would stay the same. Except now they had the added benefit of staging fights with a single camera, and they had actual editing. It would become standard operating procedure for Avengers episodes to end in an all-in wrestling ending, which is not always the most particularly imaginative way to end an episode, but the fight scenes are highly energetic. Having a woman involved in the action was still relatively new for television, and often actresses were doubled by male stuntmen wearing wigs.
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
From the colour episodes, the production began hiring a female stunt performer, Sid Child, who usually doubled for the women.
It's unethical, just not cricket.
You said that, too.
We need a drink.
That you haven't said.
The Avengers was not the only series that started off videotaped in a multi-camera studio and then morphed into a single-camera film series, but it does provide us with a good example of the differences between the two media. When the series began, the per-episode budget started at around £3,500 for the earliest episodes, up to £6,000 by the time Honor Blackman left the series. Once the series moved to film, that budget was now, depending on who's telling the story, between £35,000 and £55,000 an episode. For comparison's sake, a 50-minute episode of Thunderbirds cost roughly £38,000, while a 25-minute episode of Doctor Who in its early years cost around £2,500.
That's very good.
It's 2, 2, 1.
That's right.
1.
A brand new Mini could be had for between £500 and £600 in the 60s. So that's 5 Minis to make an episode of Doctor Who, compared to about 80 Minis minimum for an episode of The Avengers on film. And it's at that point you no longer wonder why finding a parking space is so hard.
I don't get it.
The words kinky and perverse were used to describe the Avengers by some at the time, but now the show seems to have less kinks than a cheap garden hose. That is until you get to the 4th season episode A Touch of Brimstone, which is an occasionally banned episode. It's not explicitly about an S&M bondage club, but it might as well be since the Hellfire Club in the episode clearly shops at the same store as my former accountant Hamden Costello Sherwood, also known as Forrest Gimp.
There is one thing I'd like to do with you. 2, 3, 4, 5.
Diana Rigg at several points during her tenure on the series was unhappy with certain aspects and wanted to leave.
I absolutely refuse to do it.
Once the Emma Peel episodes took off in America, there was no way they were going to continue the series at this point without her. All through the show's run, there were production realities and schedules that often required multiple episodes to be rehearsed or filmed at the same time. In many episodes, one character would be featured while the other would show up at the start and end of an episode. Sometimes you'd see a one-off stand-in character who would appear once and then would never be mentioned again. Just like that Christmas dinner where Auntie Beryl introduced us to Uncle Jock, who of course was never heard from again. The 5th season, the second with Diana Rigg, went to glorious colour, just as most of the British film series made for a worldwide market were also going to colour. By worldwide market, read the USA, since according to UK rivals ITC, program makers who managed to sell series to America in the 60s would make more money than selling to the rest of the world combined.
There you are, Mrs. Peel.
Unlike the ITC shows, the Avengers made few concessions to the American market. It was perhaps their quintessential Britishness or perceived Britishness that actually made it such a unique proposition in the American market.
To turn up in armour really is very inconvenient.
You're telling me I couldn't find a dress to match it?
Having said that, there was a direction from Up on High to tone down some of the more comedic aspects to the series. And yes, 1 or 2 concessions were made for the US market. The Avengers was proudly brought to you by aluminum. Season 5's most appropriate epithet is that it is surreal. Some might say wacky, silly, loony, or even madcap. But it doesn't degenerate into stupidity, as happened to Uncle Reg when he bought a French vineyard in the Champagne region of France and converted it into making cheap Prosecco for Aldi.
These two villains have swapped minds with Steed and Emma. So at the moment, the villains look like this, while our delightfully dashing duo Steed and Emma look like this.
There are people dying in unusual or inexplicable circumstances, eccentric, over-the-top characters obsessed with a particular thing, with Steed and Peel being slightly above it all. The show was bizarre without being especially off-putting to a general audience. This season you'd have lots of different eccentric organisations and people. Cat fanciers.
The Philanthropic Union for Rescue, Relief and Recuperation of Cats.
A well-spoken chimney sweep.
British Venusian Society.
Friends of ghosts.
Fog. Friends of Ghosts.
Murderous nannies. Killer this, that or the other, with the other being particularly dangerous.
He's wearing gloves!
Innocuous things that suddenly blow up and do some major plot to steal this, take over that, or kill whoever was sitting behind the wrong desk that week.
My turn.
The 5th season episodes are the show's high watermark. Even if they don't contain all of the show's best episodes, they would prove to be the most remembered by the general public, if not the series' diehard fans. The show's crowd-pleasing silliness was at an all-time high, with plots often delving into science fiction territory. Sometimes the show alluded to something that was more fantastical but would dial it back with the eventual explanation, like it wasn't really time travel, or it wasn't really aliens but just a laser. Again, the season had a kind of format. Usually, 2 or 3 people are murdered in an unusual way, 2 or 3 people who had one thing in common. There was a man who electrocuted victims, a plot involving a process to shrink objects, a village that turned a blind eye to murder, and a return visit by the series' only recurring threat, the Cybernauts. Cybernauts were basically robots who killed people with a karate chop. They appeared twice during the original series, each time with a different master, and once again in the 70s revival, The New Avengers. The colourful, stylish and ridiculously fun 5th season episodes tended to be repeated more often, since A, they were in colour, and B, they featured Diana Rigg. No one could imagine the Avengers without Diana Rigg. Well, Diana Rigg could. Rigg would leave after the 5th season, ostensibly to make films like The Assassination Bureau, and of course she followed Honor Blackman into a James Bond film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where Rigg was hired to class up a film starring an inexperienced lead, George Lazenby, who of course would go on to play Bond just the once. Just as I rode a motorbike blindfolded on an icy mountain road just the once.
Any more useful information?
Yes, turkeys.
For the show's 6th season, production company ABC hired a new producer, John Bryce, who had worked on the videotaped episodes. Bryce hired a new replacement sidekick, fresh out of drama school, Linda Thorson.
Practically everyone does when they hear my name. Tara, you see. Ta-ra-ra-boom, dear.
The first few episodes were apparently a bit of a disaster. Scripts seemed to be missing the series' magic, and an attempt to dye Thorson's hair blonde ended with her hair falling out, and very soon ABC fired Bryce and rehired Brian Clemens and Albert Fennell as producers.
I have very expensive dinner for two.
Who's paying?
I am.
I obey.
Tara King was a little younger than Emma Peel, but quickly became devoted to Steed. The character was often written fairly similarly to Emma Peel, just without the title Mrs., just to spice things up. Thorson was Canadian, but studied acting in the UK before being cast as Tara King. Thorson wasn't Clemens and Fennell's pick, but they weren't thinking of recasting. Those early episodes were restructured slightly with re-edits and reshoots. The giveaway is that Thorson usually has blonde hair, or more accurately, a blonde wig in the earliest episodes. Diana Rigg was coaxed back for one more episode for Mrs. Peel to be written out of the series and hand over the role to Tara King. Of course, Mr. Peel, who'd been missing presumed dead, was found presumed alive, and so at the end of that episode Emma Peel drives off with Peter Peel. Well, she sure has a type, I'll give her that.
He likes his tea stirred anti-clockwise.
Tara King dresses like everybody's cool aunt in the 70s, but Linda Thorson probably wore it better. If I wanted to be uncharitable, I'd call her look Maud.
Hello, Tara King.
Tara also drives a Lotus. Well, I think it's one of the ugliest cars of the 60s, the mid-engined Lotus Europa. Tara could hold her own in a battle, and indeed there were many Steed-like episodes where King held the episode together. Macnee at the time wasn't so sure the character worked as well, but soon the two castmates were working reasonably well together as a cohesive unit. Tara King as a character seems stronger in the episodes where Steed was not around. When he was around, Tara was often in awe of his experience as an agent.
You may well ask, where are we going?
Where are we going?
Turn left.
Did they? Were they? Would they? Had they? Should they? Shall they? Or maybe they shan't. Perhaps, perhaps not. What are we talking about? I've got no idea. The final season also gave Steed another boss, Mother, played by Patrick Newell. Mother was mainly wheelchair-bound and seemed to harumph a lot in weird locations, looked after by his assistant Rhonda. Macnee didn't like the character, but liked the actor. Macnee in fact would remain on good terms with most of his castmates, though in his autobiography he does feel he was a little harsh on Linda Thorson's performance. Linda Thorson as Tara King is still pretty good, she just had the misfortune to come after Blackman and Rigg. But there is something about the final season. It's entertaining, competently made, and I grew to enjoy the Steed-Tara King pairing. But while the show still has quirky and silly touches, outlandish design and exaggerated characters, it doesn't seem to be particularly amusing, with things often played very straight. We're at the point where the Avengers felt more like the ITC shows in production at the same time, series like Department S and The Saint.
Oh, Steed! You'll never guess what I'm doing.
Icing a cake?
The Avengers had lost a little of its charm. It wasn't suddenly serious, but the surrealism that had defined the 5th season was dialed right back. The show still had espionage elements and some absurdist material, mainly in the epilogues.
Yes, but a thing like this, and in your own backyard. It must have been expensive.
But the final season was very much a mystery show. The 60s style that had pervaded the Diana Rigg shows was clearly changing into the garish look of the early 70s. The Avengers still had weird moments, but now it was like an art gallery sticking all of its Picassos in the back room while still displaying a single Magritte. By 1969, the spell had been broken in the US, with the 6th season's ratings down thanks to strong competition from Laugh-In.
I've got to do it, Steed.
With no US buyer on the horizon, the series would end production in 1969. Also of note, Laugh-In had taken a time slot that had originally been promised to Star Trek, so it could have very easily ended up as a battle between two classic 60s series. When the Avengers did end, it left Steed and Tara in space.
They'll be back. You can depend on it.
When the show moved to film, out went the library music played into the studio, and in came a new upbeat, playful but still jazzy score by new composer Laurie Johnson. The new filmed episodes featured a new theme tune, one that would become one of the most recognisable TV themes of the 1960s. A number of filmed episodes were remakes of videotaped episodes, because why not? They're not 100% shot-for-shot remakes, but they do give us a good way to compare production methods between the two media, how the show evolved over time, and if you like, it's a good way to compare Cathy Gale to Emma Peel.
Oh, how to say nothing in 500 well-chosen words.
With the Avengers running for so long, it did feature the cream of Britain's acting talent throughout its run. Charlotte Rampling, Brian Blessed, Donald Sutherland, Christopher Lee, Penelope Keith, Peter Bowles, Bernard Cribbins, Peter Cushing, John Cleese, Jeffrey Palmer, Joss Ackland. Doctor Who stars John Pertwee, Nicholas Courtney, Roger Delgado, Kate O'Mara, Anthony Ainley, Annika Wills. Also, future Blake 7 stars Jacqueline Pearce and an uncredited Gareth Thomas. Many of the cast of Dad's Army and other comedies. Roy Kinnear, Warren Mitchell, Ronnie Barker, Paul Eddington, John Thor, Julian Glover, Gabrielle Drake, a few stars of ITC shows including Jason King himself, Peter Wingard. This actor, Jeremy Lloyd, would go on to be one half of the duo behind Allo Allo and Are You Being Served? And of course there were many other faces familiar to viewers of British television made in the 60s and beyond. I could be here all day listing them, but I've got to get to my Jazz Tab dance recital in half an hour and I still have to warm up. Oops, but I almost forgot Michael Gough.
It's Michael Gough, it's Michael Gough, it's Michael Gough.
I don't understand.
The Avengers made such an impression that the series would be parodied in other shows, Get Smart and The Simpsons for example.
I saw that on television.
Very good, but keep your voice down, Mrs. Peel.
The Avengers was also not shy about taking the piss out of rival programs. The show did come along at a time when spy-themed television movies were in high demand.
Don't touch that, we may be in orbit.
You've caused quite a constellation.
Even though the Avengers predated the Bond movies, the series hit its stride just as TV companies were desperate for more spy series. In Britain you had the ITC series, which seemed to magically pivot from single heroes to having a team of crime fighters. The BBC for its part occasionally dabbled with imports, but the nearest they came to trying to create their own quirky crime fighting series was when Sidney Newman, who created the Avengers and moved to the BBC where he created Doctor Who, later created Adam Adamant Lives, about a Victorian gentleman adventurer who finds himself in the mid-1960s.
So, why don't you just untie these silly ropes and let me go?
I found it hard to single out the best and worst episodes, so I'll just point out a few of my favourites. Dressed to Kill saw John Steed mysteriously invited to a fancy dress party on a train, and the same story was remade as The Superlative 7, and I enjoy both versions. A second season episode with Dr. King, probably no relation to Tara, has Steed investigating a plane crash in a show that's completely devoid of humour and is really quite dark in tone. Brief for Murder, in which Gale and Steed hire some lawyers who apparently can get anyone off a murder charge. Room Without a View and Death at Bargain Prices sees Emma Peel go undercover.
He said, Mrs. Peel is in ladies' underwear. I rattled up the stairs 3 at a time.
Mary Quip's department on the 5th floor, sir.
Wish You Were Here sees Tara King trapped in a country hotel.
Now you're in the same boat. A prisoner.
And my all-time favourite episode is also the first episode I ever saw, From Venus with Love, which for me is the perfect Avengers episode. Of course, everybody will have their own favourites.
From the top, if you please.
Truby Homburg, a bowler cap. Jockey pork pie topper, boater Busby Fez.
Bravo.
After the series ended, Honor Blackman obviously appeared in the Bond film Goldfinger as well as many films and television series. Diana Rigg, likewise, as a serious actress, would appear in lots of films, briefly having her own series in the US. And yes, she appeared in a Bond movie on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Patrick Macnee, yes, he was in a Bond movie, A View to a Kill. He'd move to America and be that guy who appeared in everything, horror movies and episodes of TV shows, providing voices for the series Battlestar Galactica as well as a memorable guest appearance. Look, it is amusing to me at least to see Macnee randomly pop up in Automan, or Magnum, or War of the Worlds, or A Man from U.N.C.L.E. Reunion, or Spinal Tap. Linda Thorson has a long list of guest star appearances, but relevant to this channel, she pops up as a Cardassian in Star Trek The Next Generation.
You are remarkably short-sighted, New Dak.
Behind-the-scenes personnel, producers Albert Fennell, Brian Clemens and composer Laurie Johnson would form a production company to make the new Avengers in the mid-70s, and would follow that up with the late 70s action series The Professionals. And for some reason, Clemens was a writer on Highlander 2 The Quickening. Honor Blackman and Diana Rigg would each make a guest appearance in Doctor Who, the latter appearing with her daughter Rachel Sterling. Diana Rigg would also win a new generation of fans with her scene-stealing performances in Game of Thrones.
You can smell the shit from 5 miles away.
There would be a stage play, a radio series, Big Finish audio stories and merchandise, though I can't see how a kid's umbrella hiding a sword would have gotten past legal after that terrible incident during testing.
Yes, whoever was paying him would certainly have got their money's worth.
And while the series was gone, it was not forgotten. It was popular in Europe, and yes, I know that's a punchline, but in the case of the Avengers, that popularity saw it repeated again and again. And it was not just in Europe. I mean, for some reason, in the mid-1980s, one network here started playing Avengers episode in prime time, 7:30 on a Thursday night, and I can't remember if it was a non-ratings period. It was my first experience of the series, and yes, it was just the colour Diana Rigg episodes. A mid-70s champagne commercial for the French market reunited Patrick Macnee and Linda Thorson, which in turn sparked the idea of a new series. The new Avengers arrived in 1976, bringing together a more mature John Steed with two younger offsiders, Gambit and Purdy. There were 26 episodes of slightly less silly and slightly more grounded adventures, though they weren't really a huge stretch from the Tara King episodes. There were various motion picture projects, one of which was even mooted while Honor Blackman was still appearing in the series. Then there was talk of an American-financed motion picture, the development of which, like Guy Fawkes' Left Testicle, dragged on for ages. Even more unfortunate, the eventual film that was released in 1998, which tried very hard to be hated by almost anybody who happened to see it. The failure of that film has basically put a lid on the Avengers as a viable IP.
You don't really believe all this rot, do you?
I checked the local TV schedules, they are still repeating Emma Peel episodes.
It goes around and around, and it all comes out there.
But there are 5 and a bit seasons of a stylish and quirky time capsule for anybody who wants to revisit that world. The Avengers has little actual avenging, but it has a charming crime-fighting duo with bags of style.
Always keep your bowler on in times of stress.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
Yes, yes.
Watch next week.